I'm Ian Haywood, by the way. I'm former president of the British Association of Romantic Studies, or BARS, so some of you may know me. I was president for 4 years up to 2019 before Anthony Mandel took over, and before that I was vice president under Nicky Watson. So I've been involved with BARS for some time. So hello everyone as you arrive. Very nice to see you. The wonders of technology are making this, a truly global event, both in terms of the speakers and, of course, attendees who are supporting the event. The latest in the series of BARS digital events. So as I say, I'm still giving it a few minutes before I introduce our speakers. We've got a great panel lined up. I propose to wait a couple more minutes until we've admitted quite a few more. So do keep on posting where you're from. It's fantastic to see, isn't it, colleagues from all around the world. We've now got Paris, Washington, Cambridge, Oxford, Greece, Spain, Finland. I'm flicking through the chat. Iowa, Algeria, sunny Alberta, Glasgow, Dublin, Cape Town, and on it goes. What would our romantic writers think of this, I wonder? Probably they would. I would like to think they'd be pleased with being able to have a global audience in this way, even if they were writing from Grasmere, or Keswick or wherever, London. So just a few points of protocol here, as you can see on the screen. It's once the speakers begin, please, turn your camera off, so it doesn't distract the speakers, but also I think just keeps the bandwidth manageable. But once we come to the question and answer session later on, you're very welcome then, of course, to put your camera back on. As this screen is saying to you, as you listen to the speakers, as you've got questions, do put them in the chat, and the BARS team, digital events team, will be keeping an eye on that, monitoring it, and we'll feed the questions through to me so that I can then hopefully do justice to them in the question and answer session at the end, and put these questions to the speakers. But I think, invite people they'd like to actually ask the question sort of live, which makes it, closer to an in-person event, doesn't it? So we're already above 100. I'm just going to give it another minute or so, and then I think I'll introduce the speakers, even though we might still be admitting people, but because we've got such a bumper lineup of speakers, I don't want to impinge on their time too much. So as I say, keep on telling us where you're all coming from. Colleagues from the UK, of course, Canada, New York, Edinburgh, Iran, Istanbul. Wonderful, isn't it? Truly, truly global. Washington, DC, yeah. So, as you can see, the title of this session is Romantic Forms, which is, a very all-embracing title, isn't it? We anticipate with great eagerness how our speakers are going to interpret this question of form. We have a lineup that I would in UK terms, call early career. That means, you know, everything from postgraduate PhD through postdoctoral to the first years of a faculty or full-time position. So there's a commonality in that sense about the speakers. Without more ado, then I think I'm going to tell you who the 5 speakers are, and then I'll introduce our first speaker in a little bit more detail. So we have 5 speakers. They're all going to speak for about 10 minutes. We'll listen to each presentation in turn. So I will introduce the speaker in a little bit more detail before the talk. And then at the end, which should be around 6 o'clock-ish, we'll have the 30 minutes or so for the Q&A. So I hope that's all right. So we're going to listen to the 5 presentations in order. So our 5 speakers are Shellie Audsley, who's from the University of Hong Kong. So Shelley will be going up first. Then we have Amanda Auerbach from the Catholic University in Washington, DC, who will be second. We have Anne-Claire Michoux from the University of Zurich, who will be third. Rebekah Musk from Lancaster University here in the UK, who will be fourth. And then Jack Rooney from Ohio State University, who will be fifth, as I say, and then we will move on to the actual Q&A. So I think, without more ado, I'm going to introduce Shelley. All the speakers, I think, will have presentations. If there's any technical hitches, which can happen with Zoom and remote events, we've got backup systems in place. So there's no need for anyone to panic. If for any reason there was a disruption to any of the presentations, we would, and it can't be remedied quickly, we'll move on to the next speaker, and then we'll come back to that presentation. So as I say, put your questions along with comments in the chat as we go along. So without more ado, our first speaker is Shellie Audsley, who is an MPhil student from the University of Hong Kong. And as you'll have appreciated, our speakers, again, it's truly global event, which is wonderful. And I believe it's quite late there, so we're delighted that Shelley's here speaking to us. Everyone's in different time zones. Shelley's current thesis explores, with the aid of a narratological framework, narrative lyric interaction and its tenacious ties to the sublime in a transgeneric range of poems by Byron, Percy Shelley, Keats and Edgar Allan Poe. More broadly, her interests lie in the link between narratology and poetics, as well as hybrid texts that blend and shift between genres, forms and modes. And Shelley's title is "If I Must Make a Prison of Our Palace," that's a quote, colon, "the unities, lyricity and Byron's tragic sublime in Sardanapalus." So if you're good to go, Shelley, over to you. And I'm going to disappear as well while I listen to your talk.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen now. All right. So I think it's working. Okay, thank you. Okay. Of Byron's 3 closet tragedies that were written according to the classical principles of the unities of place, time, and action, the 1821 play Sardanapalus stands out as one in which the poet most explicitly defends his adherence to these classical formal constraints. Despite the neoclassical influence of the Italian closet dramatist Vittorio Alfieri, under which Byron's play was under which Byron's play was composed, a number of scholars have pinpointed the many ways that Byron deviates from and reinvents the classical dramatic form by manipulating its generic features. Peter Cawthron has noted that the depth of the characters on the imaginary stage of Sardanapalus have infused the play with more physical action than typical classical dramas, where the act of dying is always hidden from view. More than that, Dana Van Coy in her article Speculative Tragedy and Spatial Play elaborates on Byron's opening up of the closed world of tragedy in the play's final act, where death is conceived not as a dead end or defeat, but an entrance into a utopian posthumous future of endless possibilities. I hope to extend these observations on Byron's reworking of this dramatic genre by focusing on how the classical unities are juxtaposed with segments of lyricity, specifically to develop and foreground, even on a structural level, the play's central narrative conflict, as well as the poet's tragic sublime. In the palace where the entire play is set in the span of one day, Sardanapalus, the debauched, paradoxically effeminate ruler, comes to be seen as a psychologically complex character, whose hope for peace and enjoyment simply are not compatible with that which is expected of him as a kingly descendant of warriors. Proclaiming in the very first act, when the imminent threat is first announced, "If I must make a prison of our palace, at least we'll wear our fetters jocundly." Sardanapalus renders the palace of his ancestors into a paradise of revel and indulgence. Even when the danger outside confines him within the palace hall, he is adamant that his hall be decorated for the festivity to take place indoors. Yet his characteristic flippancy belies an unspoken weariness. When the palace turns into a fortress against the encroaching rebels' forces in Act 5, and eventually a funeral pyre, it becomes clear that all his kingly inheritance, most consistently signified by the palace and its walls, is indeed nothing but a prison that holds him hostage. Preferring Bacchus, the Greek god of wine, music, and festivity, to Semiramis, his legendary ancestor whose militant glory he attributes to contemptible bloodshed and sacrifices. His wish is to be the carefree shepherd king of patriarchal time, living in an idyllic world free of conflict and stagecraft. Throughout the play, Sardanapalus' ineffectual idealism conflicts with the obligations imposed on him by birth, as he refuses to forego either one. It is in light of this narrative conflict that the interplay between the unities and lyricity becomes most prominent. The fixedness and singularity of place, time, and action establishes a boundary on the textual level which the lyric monologues and duologues of Sardanapalus and Myra, his equally individualistic companion, tirelessly resist. In particular, their lyric expression serves not only to reveal their interior thoughts, but also to structurally disrupt the play's temporality and spatiality. Just as Sardanapalus' nightmare about banqueting with his dead ancestors in Act 3 explicates his anxiety over becoming assimilated into the bloodless former rulers of his kingdom, his extended recount of what he describes as a palpable vision puts a halt in the rising action in the besieged palace, as well as the imminent reality of the usurpation. The recount ends with Myra's promise to him of her companionship into the future. While short-lived in the grand scheme of things, the transient and illusionary moments of private recollection and exchange such as this one are all the two characters can afford to forestall, if not prevent, the inevitable tragedy of their circumstances. Much like Wordsworth's spots of time, spatial temporal signs of recollection and renovation. These segments of romantic lyricity are their instruments both for representing and preserving their sense of identity against the external world which continually seeks to alter or destroy them. In this manner fit into the rigid dramatic framework, Lyricity undermines the play's structurally constructed sense of predestination by pulling into view the character's subtle defiance. In the last description of Sardanapalus' funeral pyre and his vision of the future of his legacy, he surrenders neither the dignity of the king nor the idealism of himself. Having secured a metaphoric way out of the palace, he is to be relieved of his post. Once again, in a subtle leap of thought, which has before then turned his palace into a prison and then a fortress, his impending demise is fantasized into the beginning of a future of liberation, though only with imagined success. Still within the same hall in the palace, the tragedy of Sardanapalus is structurally embodied in the play's formal construction, in the very persistence of the classical unities over its lyricity of idealism, the futility of which runs parallel to the protagonist's ultimate failure to physically surmount the confines of external impositions. Thus, Byron's tragic sublime, like Sardanapalus' tangible reality, is doubly staged in both the textual and conceptual levels of the play, caught in the struggle between unyielding boundaries and surges of false transcendence. It's a really short one, but that's it.
Oh, thank you very much. You're getting lots of applause, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. Shelley, I've certainly, you've already sparked my synapses going with all questions, both about those closet dramas that Byron wrote in 1821, you know, why that year does he turn to that form? You know, how do we place those forms, you know, both within his biography and within the kind of political sphere. So I'm sure there are going to be questions, and you've been reminded, everyone, please post them in the chat. So that's thanks for a terrific opening. So we'll now move on to the second speaker then, who is Amanda Auerbach, who is Assistant Professor of English at the Catholic University in Washington, DC. Amanda's current book project focuses on moments and characters in 18th and 19th century British novels get socially or geographically lost. She argues that these episodes of getting lost define subgenres of the novel, including the marriage plot and the Gothic novel, as forms of emotional, mental, and potentially physical movement. And articles drawn from this project have already appeared in European Romantic Review and Victorian Literature and Culture, and we may have links to those if Amanda provides them, you know, as we go through this evening. And Amanda, who's ready and waiting, I see her. Amanda's paper title is this, quote, Lost Without You, Failing the Marriage Plot in Frances Burney's Camilla. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you. Yes, I don't have a PowerPoint slide made, but I have a presentation nonetheless. So yeah, in the chapter from which this talk comes, I focus on moments in 18th century novels when heroines end up dangerously paired with men. And these episodes superficially resemble the trajectory of the marriage plot itself, for the goal is to become matrimonially paired. In earlier novels like Samuel Richardson's Sir Charles Grandison or Eliza Haywood's Betsy Thoughtless, the heroine who finds herself paired with a man faces the risk of rape or reputational damage. By the time Frances Burney wrote Camilla in 1796, marriage plot novels did not as frequently raise the possibility that the heroine could become a so-called lost or fallen woman, especially moving forward when we think about someone like Jane Austen. But episodes of pairing off with men in Camilla show that in a marriage-centric culture, a heroine who has yet to marry could experience the same kind, if not the same degree, of social lostness as victims of assault or slander in earlier novels. So Burney's novel offers evidence of this connection between a woman who is lost and one who is merely single, in a seemingly insignificant episode in which, after Edgar has signaled his desire to break off his engagement with Camilla, she wanders through Southampton with Mrs. Mitten and gets mistaken for a prostitute. And Sarah Ahmed's recent discussion of marital happiness will help me articulate how exactly Camilla's personal romantic disappointment constitutes a form of social lostness. So in The Pursuit of Happiness, Ahmed points out that marriage continues to be seen as a leading happiness cause. In spite of the impossibility of inferring causation from correlation, married people are happier. The discourse of happiness can then transform the social norm of marriage into a social good. In the words of Ahmed, attribution of happiness might be how social norms and ideals become affective, as if relative proximity to those norms and ideals creates happiness. Camilla must become proximate to the ideal of marriage to make herself and her family happy. In the world of Burney's novel, which takes this affective norm to heart, the consequence of failing to achieve marital happiness is the destruction of the self and the family. Camilla's uncle and family members regard her with partiality above her siblings and cousins, a partiality which is inextricable from the benefits she provides for them. She benefits her uncle much as a novel might, we are told. She exhilarated him with pleasure, she supplied him with ideas, and from the morning's first dawn to the evening's latest close, his eye followed her light-springing figure, or his ear vibrated with her sportive sounds. The pleasure she affords her family in her early life is unalloyed. Once she reaches the marriageable age of 17, however, emotional investment brings those who love her not just happiness, but anxiety. We are told, Camilla was now just 17 years of age and attractively lovely, but of a character that called for more attention to its development than to its formation, though of a disposition so engaging that affection kept pace with watchfulness, and her fond parents knew, as little for their own sakes as for hers, how to part with her. Her qualities had a power which, without consciousness of how or consideration why, governed her whole family. The airy thoughtlessness of her nature was a source of perpetual amusement, and if sometimes her vivacity raised a fear for her discretion, the innocence of her mind reassured after every alarm. The interest which she excited served to render her the first object of the house. It was just short of solicitude, yet kept it constantly alive. For Camilla's parents, it is difficult to disentangle whether their anxious emotional investment in her is more for their own sakes or for hers. Is their watchful affection just short of solicitude for Camilla, or in order to sustain the affective life of the house? The fact that anxiety correlates to pleasure when beholding Camilla means that she sustains the family insofar as she remains more an object of hope than of despair. She must remain on track to come to a good end, which the assumption is she will if she stays innocent. To become disappointed and disappointing becomes equated to morally straying. Just as Camilla's parents assume their emotional investment in their daughter must be for her sake, she also assumes that the actions they encourage her to take are primarily for her benefit. But the plot of Camilla's mounting debts suggests that this is not exactly true. It has seemed excessive to critics that the heroine takes so to heart her debts, which are trifling compared to those of her brother Lionel and her cousin Claremont. But the reason is that her financial debt embodies the much more extensive emotional burden her family has heaped on her compared to her male relatives. Camilla could not be the dutiful daughter that she is if she recognized her love plot for what it is, the plot in which her family burden her with their happiness, which she converts into a personal sense of indebtedness. The source of Camilla's familial downfall is her debt, but the cause of her failed relationship with Edgar is the interactions with other men that she stages to encourage him to marry her. For instance, she encourages Sir Sedley to propose, so that she can then reject his proposal and show Edgar her disinterestedness. On a later occasion, she entertains the advances of other men in order to display to Edgar her ease of mind. Such performances, unsurprisingly, diminish her social and moral status in the eyes of Edgar, making her finally appear, quote, lost to domestic felicity. More mysterious than the question of why Camilla takes her small debts so much to heart is the question, why doesn't she see, even after repeated evidence, that her interactions with other men will only harm her prospects with Edgar? Camilla cannot anticipate Edgar's judgment because doing so would mean recognizing the significance of her father's act of sending her away from her family and into social settings in which her moral and social status are rendered insecure. Once Mr. Tyrrell witnesses his daughter's partiality and Edgar's frigidness toward her as a result of a temporary misunderstanding, he banishes her from her uncle's house at Cleves, quote, gently yet clearly, intimating his wish that she should remain at the Grove with her friend Mrs. Arlbury. The unmistakability and timing of the request to make it clear that Mr. Tyrrell's wish is a wish. The word is not just a euphemism for a command, but expresses his desire that she go away, where she can no longer compromise his dignity. The fact that her perceived moral status is invariably secure when she is at home with her family suggests the significance of what her family has done in sending her away. Furthermore, Camilla's initial distress at being seen by Edgar to visit Mrs. Arlbury suggests that she sees that connection between visiting friends and apparently straying. Her family has consigned her to the appearance of moral lostness as soon as she has ceased to repay their sympathetic investment. She cannot allow herself to face that even before her parents officially banish her from their presence as a result of her financial debt, they have already banished her as a source of disappointment, seriously imperiling her marital prospects. Now, the social lostness that unfolds from Camilla's financial debt, but most fundamentally from her failure to secure Edgar, are extreme. Her father is taken to debtor's prison for her debts. Forbidden from returning home by her mother, Camilla must stay anonymously at the house of people who were formerly objects of her charity. She has to trade in her possessions for rent and scrawl desperate notes to her family and Edgar. Crucially, Edgar finds Camilla and the notes before she has a chance to send them, returns her love, and this alone, one can only assume from the previous operation of the plot, enables Camilla to return to the bosom of her family. The power of affective norms, crucial to so many marriage plot novels, plays out more dramatically in Burney's novel than in later, less sensational ones. Burney supposedly based Camilla on Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. If Radcliffe's novel shows the perils of marriage, including domestic imprisonment and death, then Burney's focuses on the dangers of remaining unmarried after the expectation of marriage has once been raised. The consequence of not receiving a prompt enough proposal is to be deemed lost to domestic felicity, and then, were it not for an act of providence, to actually become so. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that stimulating talk. Again, lots to think about there in terms of the ideology of form, questions of space, domestic space, social space, the play on the word lost. So I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. People will be formulating those questions as the evening progresses. Terrific. We'll move on to our third speaker, Anne-Claire Michoux, who is a postdoctoral lecturer at the University of Zurich. Anne-Claire's current project explores the representation of women's voice in the long 18th century and considers, among genres, the role of drama as a privileged site for depictions of female speech. Anne-Claire is in the process of completing a monograph on the construction of British national identity in women's writing of the Romantic period. And the title of the talk this evening is Elizabeth Inchbald's, quote, Remarks for the British Theatre, 1808, and Radical Politics. Over to you, Anne-Claire.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, I hope that everyone can hear me and see that I've got a very small PowerPoint. Sorry, I can't actually get to the next slide. Sorry about that. So this year marks the bicentenary of the death of the celebrated actress, playwright, novelist, and theatre critic Elizabeth Inchbald. When the publisher Thomas Longman approached her in 1805 to provide introductions for the new series The British Theatre, which launched in 1806, Inchbald was the acclaimed if controversial author of the radical novels A Simple Story and Nature and Art, and many successful plays, including Everyone Has His Fault and Lover's Vows. The name Mrs. Inchbald alone was a guarantee of commercial success. The British Theatre was an ambitious project that comprised 125 recently produced popular plays in 25 volumes. While, as critics have recognised, Inchbald was ambivalent concerning her involvement in this collection, she did not select the plays and found the task arduous, asking early on to be released from the project. This paper argues that her prefatory remarks, far from adding little to her fortune and nothing whatever to her fame, as her biographer James Bowden claimed, not only contributed to Inchbald's recognition as a professional writer, but also served as a vehicle for her radical politics. Scholars have recently argued that Inchbald's remarks represent an important contribution to theatre history, the prefaces often discussing the different merits of a play performed on stage or read in the closet, the importance of individual performance rendition of a part, and the didactic function of drama. What has perhaps received less attention are the ways in which Inchbald's theatrical criticism echoes the radical politics of her fiction and drama. Aimed at middle-class readers, the remarks address an impressive range of social and political issues, including slavery, social inequalities, the unequal terms on which women's writing is received, and the vexed question of women's education and marriage. Objections to Inchbald undertaking the masculine form of criticism were expressed earlier on, most famously by George Coleman the Younger, who was rather piqued that his plays had been somewhat singed in passing the fiery ordeal of feminine fingers, fingers which it grieves me to see destined to a rough task, from which your manly contemporaries in the drama would naturally shrink. James Bowden concurred, explaining that there is something unfeminine too in a lady's placing herself in the seat of judgment. Criticism has been commonly supposed more nearly allied to learning than to genius. As learning seldom appears in a female garb, it is commonly thought that criticism requires something beyond genius to arm itself fully for its awful task. Both Coleman and Bowden therefore present literary criticism as a strictly masculine form, incompatible with female sensibility. Inchbald and abilities. Inchbald's prefaces reflect on such opposition to women's professional ventures, be they as authors or as performers. The biographical account of Susanna St. Liver notes that she encountered the masculine enterprise of an author, reflecting Inchbald's understanding that authorship is predominantly a male activity. This, she explained, adds greater pressure to the reception of women's work. Mrs. St. Liver, she writes, as a woman falls more particularly under censure than her contemporary writers. Inchbald, moreover, mentions on two separate occasions William Congreve's jealousy of St. Liver's success, attributing his departure from the theatrical world to his outrage that a play written by a woman could overshadow his own work. Such peevish jealousy could also be found among performers. Inchbald, who regularly points out the absence or the lack of development of female parts, comments enthusiastically that in Arthur Murphy's The Grecian Daughter, the men's characters have all been sacrificed by the author to the valour of a woman. He has made his female do the deed of a man and his best man perform the act of a child. As a result, no actor likes to appear in the part, Inchbald then adds, echoing, it seems, Mary Robinson's claim in A Letter to the Women of England that man can bear no equal, he dreads the power of women. The remarks for the British theatre thus astutely address the gender politics of professional authorship and acting. Another issue that animates many of Inchbald's prefatory remarks, which is also at the heart of her novel A Simple Story and is central to feminist writing of the Romantic period, is the question of women's education. Inchbald's strategy is to emphasise the fact that improved female education reflects positively on the nation at large, a strategy adopted by other contemporary women writers. Inchbald objects passionately to the character of Mrs. Malaprop in Sheridan's The Rivals, because it will lead future generations to conclude that the advance of female knowledge in Great Britain at the end of the 18th century was far more tardy than in any other European nation. What Inchbald means by advance of female knowledge is, like Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Hayes, and Mary Robinson, among others, is access to a masculine education. The introduction to Nicholas Rowe's The Fair Penitent offers a detailed examination of this issue. While Inchbald does not condone the heroine's adulterous behaviour, the blame is placed not on an innate frailty of the female sex, but on the heroine's inadequate education, which enabled Lothario's seduction of her. An early 19th century Callista, Inchbald claims, would never give him the time of day, and the quotation is on the slide. Since the ladies of Great Britain have learnt to spell and have made other short steps in the path of literature, the once highly favoured Lothario of illiterate times has sunk in estimation, and there is scarcely a woman of this country who can sympathise in the grief of the fair penitent, whose degraded taste could prefer to an honourable and valiant youth his skipping, dancing, worthless rival. Whatever reasons may be urged against the more elevated instruction of the sex at present than in former days, one good consequence at least accrues from it. They are better qualified than heretofore to choose their lovers and husbands. It was in the age of female ignorance that the Lotharios and the yet viler Lovelaces flourished. Now, enlightened by a degree of masculine study, women's taste and judgment being improved, this best consequent of all ensues: men must improve to win them. Enlightened by a degree of masculine study, a phrase that echoes Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of women and other proto-feminist texts, women have greater control over their lives and greater agency. The remarks to Thomas Morton, The Way to Get Married, develop the question of female agency as they encourage young women to reconsider marriage as the only avenue of personal fulfillment. To get married, Inchbald claims, is not to obtain the summit of a woman's wishes, unless in wedlock she gains a friend, a companion, a counsellor, and protector. While this observation does support the ideology of companionate marriage, it nevertheless argues that matrimony is not the sole source of happiness or social recognition for women. It also points, I think, to the notion of patriarchal tyranny that her novels explore. The preface concludes by attacking the commonplace remarks and false conclusions concerning female celibacy, thereby revising the stigma attached to spinsterhood. We can see a parallel with a positive portrait of Miss Woodley in The Simple Story, who, unmarried at the age of 30, has escaped not only the ridicule, but even the appellation of an old maid. Perhaps Inchbald's most radical comments confront the uncomfortable realities of British society at the turn of the 19th century. Inchbald addresses the distressing truth of British wealth, its indisputable connection to slavery. Thomas Southern's adaptation of Afroben's Orunoko is never acted in Liverpool, she explains, for the very reason why it ought to be acted there oftener than at any other place. The merchants of that great city acquire their riches by the slave trade. While not explicitly abolitionist, this observation nonetheless underlines the political function of drama, which confronts audiences with social realities they would rather ignore. Of Thomas Morton's eulogy on English palaces for poverty and princely endowments for calamity in the School of Reform, Inchbald wryly observes, "The English are charitable, but they are too apt to boast of their benevolent endowments. A higher boast would be to have fewer paupers to require them." Inchbald is here indirectly calling for a radical re-examination of social equalities and for far-reaching social transformations. A final point on which I wish to conclude is a topic that runs throughout Inchbald's writing career, the double standards in morality to which the lower classes and women in particular are exposed. The remarks to the fair penitent conclude with the observation that only the disadvantaged and disenfranchised pay the price of immorality. Loss of maiden innocence is now limited to the poor female domestic and orphan apprentice. The great will preserve importance even in their crimes, and a woman of superior rank in life is rarely guilty of a breach of chastity beneath the sin of adultery. Lovers' vows and nature and art dramatize this reality. The innocent young cottager Hannah Primrose, in Nature and Art, is seduced by the callous William Norwin. Ostracized by the local community, Hannah falls into a life of prostitution and crime, ultimately sentenced to death by the son of her assailant, who is magistrate. The great do indeed preserve importance even in their crimes. As I hope to have shown, Inchbald wove radical political messages into her theatrical criticism. Like her plays and novels, the remarks of the British theatres ask readers to question social and gender inequalities and should therefore be taught alongside Inchbald's more familiar works and in dialogue with radical writing of the Romantic period. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of applause there for Anne-Claire. And again, I'm sure people will be formulating questions, not the least, what a wonderful treasure trove you've discovered there. You know, I've been reflecting on that as you've been speaking. Without more ado, and I'm just saying, I'd like to say to our speakers that I'm very impressed by you sticking to time. So we're right on target here to the schedule. Rebekah is next. Rebekah Musk. Rebekah's a third-year PhD student at Lancaster University in the northwest of England, indeed near the Lake District. Funded by the AHRC, that's state funding. And for those of you not familiar with the UK system, through the Northwest Consortium Doctoral Training Partnership. So well done to Rebekah, because it's very competitive. The schemes are very competitive. Rebekah's research uses queer spatial theory to open up queer readings of Romantic texts, often contrary to their surface narrative. So the title of Rebekah's talk is, quote, "Now in Glimmer and Now in Gloom," end quote, visibility, vulnerability and queerness in Coleridge's Christobel. Over to you.
Thank you. Hello everyone. I'm quite excited to be here presenting today. So yeah, get going. In Romantic literature, as well as in our everyday language, there is a strong relationship between images of illumination and the revealing of knowledge. So colloquially, we describe the discovery of things which have been hidden, suppressed or forgotten as coming to light. Now, in such a phrase lies the interesting relationship between the supposed binary opposites of known and unknown, visible and hidden, and light and dark. So if illumination correlates to the revealing of knowledge, then the partial illumination of textual space suggests that there is something ahead in the narrative that we will not fully come to know. Something in the poem will remain half hidden. Now, there's something particularly queer about this state of half knowing, as it constitutes a kind of open secret. And as Cedric notes in the Epistemology of the Closet, queerness constitutes the open secret. So that is to say, the more 19th century society sought to repress same-sex desire, the more it had to acknowledge its existence. Therefore, as knowledge of queerness became more widespread, so did the need to appear to know nothing of it. Thus, queerness became something half hidden, a dimly apprehended existence shrouded by social stigma and silence. So in the poem, the two main characters, Christobel and Geraldine, initially meet in the woods at midnight. And this is a really interesting space because it oscillates between light and dark, and its strange illumination represents that something that we cannot grasp that I mentioned in the introductory bit. Their meeting also begins with a question, and who art thou? For Benjamin Grossberg, the queerness of the relationship between Christobel and Geraldine is defined by their trading off of different gender roles throughout the poem. So he suggests that at the initial moment of contact in the midnight woods, Geraldine assumes the role of the archetypal damsel in distress, whereas Christobel takes up the role of chivalrous protector. So in line with these roles, Christobel invites Geraldine to stay the night in her family's castle, even going so far as to carry her across the threshold. The gender roles that the women occupy shift as the poem continues, along with the illumination of the setting as the two women travel through the castle together. And it's this journey through the castle and how its illumination can open up different readings of the text that I want to talk about in this paper. So the journey begins with Christobel and Geraldine crossing the castle courtyard while still illuminated by weak moonlight. So you get, so free from danger, free from fear, they crossed the court, right glad they were. However, As they venture further into the castle and past the hall, a tongue of flame leaps up from the fire, instantly brightening the room. So you get, the brands were flat, the brands were dying, their own white ashes lying. But when the lady passed, there came a tongue of light, a fit of flame. And Christobel saw the lady's eye, and nothing else she saw thereby, save the boss of Sir Leoline tall, which hung in a murky odd niche on the wall. "Oh, softly tread," said Christobel, "my father seldom sleepeth well." That the flame appears to be a reaction to Geraldine's presence implies a certain resistance to her on behalf of the castle. As we have seen, the women did not feel threatened as they crossed the court in moonlight. The threat of exposure only becomes clear to them when the fire flares up. Perhaps this is because the moonlight which illuminates the court is to be expected at night and doesn't threaten to wake anyone. A sudden surge of flame, however, is unexpected, and it's the kind of illumination which may wake the household. Indeed, the fire itself seems to awaken from slumber. It is flat and lying, but suddenly rises up in a fit, like someone awaking from a nightmare. In this moment, then, Christobel and Geraldine truly become aware of the threat of exposure, realizing they could wake the occupants of the castle at any moment, causing Christobel to urge silence and remark, "My father seldom sleepeth well." The light of the flame is also reflected in two ocular surfaces, the boss of Leoline's shield and Geraldine's eye. If the former represents the negative aspect of illumination, the threat of surveillance and exposure of secrets coming to light, then the latter represents the reverse of this, illumination as discovery, potential, and knowledge. Thus, these two images counterbalance one another. The illumination of Geraldine's eye, which Christobel is so entranced by, suggests a journey of discovery, the potential to experience a new way of being. The curiosity and desire this ignites in Christobel is, however, tempered by her understanding of her place in a heteropatriarchal society and the consequences if she's caught acting outside of this. The freedom to explore different gender roles is only afforded to her by this state of half-darkness, where she's concealed from onlookers but able to perceive her own half-hidden possibilities through the gloom. So, that Christobel sees the brightness of Geraldine's illuminated eye and nothing else she saw thereby shows a kind of courage, a willingness to risk discovery in order to explore the identity and behaviour which has become accessible to her through her encounter with Geraldine. Such willingness to take this risk does not, of course, amount to recklessness, as she continues to urge silence. So, when the women reach Christobel's chamber, in how they approach illumination. Here, it is Christobel who takes control of the light in her chamber. The silver lamp burns dead and dim, but Christobel the lamp will trim. She trimmed the lamp and made it bright, and left it swinging to and fro, while Geraldine, in wretched plight, sank down upon the floor below. Here we see a reversal of the earlier scene with the fire. This time it is Christobel who illuminates the scene and Geraldine who reacts with fear. Like the fire, a lamp burning in the middle of the night has the potential to raise alarm among the castle's inhabitants, but Christobel obviously feels safe enough in her chamber to risk it. It is at this point that many critical readings of the poem perceive a shift in the relationship, claiming that it has become somehow predatory. Indeed, the relationship between Christobel and Geraldine has been variously framed as incestuous, a narrative of rape, or simply predatory and exploitative. However, few critics seem to acknowledge that this could be an entirely consensual act in which one woman is more sexually experienced than the other. Of course, the references to curses and silencing and shame in the poem often feed these interpretations as they suggest that something is wrong. However, these actions and emotions of shame and silence are often, unfortunately, aspects of the queer experience. For me, the illumination of this scene points to a more honest and open interaction. So, thus far, we have seen the importance of illumination when understanding queer space. Varying degrees of illumination remind us of the instability of the light-dark binary, but also of the constant tension between enlightenment and exposure that light symbolizes. Consequently, to be fully illuminated, fully visible, can be seen as an act of both queer courage and queer vulnerability. This is particularly evident in the following section. Beneath the lamp the lady bowed, and slowly rolled her eyes around. Then drawing in her breath aloud, like one that shuddered, she unbound the cincture from beneath her breast, her silken robe and inner vest, dropped to her feet, and in full view, behold, her bosom and half her side, a sight to dream of, not to tell. So despite how it's often interpreted, this passage reads to me as a tender expression of queer longing. Now, those of you who are familiar with the poem will note that I've chosen not to quote the final line of the stanza, which in most published works appears as, "Oh, shield her, shield sweet Christobel." And although this line would seem to belie my argument, it is important to note that in several manuscripts, and indeed the first printing, the line read, "And she is to sleep by or with Christobel." So for me, the tenderness of this moment comes from its illumination, because for queerness, visibility is on. Here we see Geraldine making herself vulnerable to Christobel. Not only is she undressing, but she is doing so in the full light of the lamp. Just as Christobel remained steady in Geraldine's gaze, despite her fear of exposure when she was illuminated by the fire, we see Geraldine allowing herself to be illuminated despite her previous fears in Christobel's gaze. Thus, we see how illumination in the poem functions as a kind of double-edged sword, offering possibility and discovery whilst also threatening exposure. As the lightscape shifts, so do the gender roles occupied by Christobel and Geraldine. But nevertheless, there must always be a degree of darkness, a shadow in which to hide from the gaze of those who wish to curtail their journey of discovery. By choosing to be visible, to stand in a bright light and be seen by each other, both women risk exposure. Yet they do so willingly, making themselves vulnerable in a moment of queer courage. In these moments of illumination, they are temporarily free to step out of the shadows, to push open the closet door, briefly letting them in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebekah. Another very stimulating talk with lots of opportunities soon to ask follow-up questions about your approach there with light and dark and queer theory. So let's move on to the final speaker before we open it up, who is Jack Rooney. There he is waiting. Jack is a doctoral candidate in English at Ohio State University. His dissertation is called "The Phantoms of a Thousand Hours, Ghostly Poetics and the Poetics of the Ghost in British Literature 1740 to 1914. And this examines the formation of the ghost as a poetical entity from the sepulchral meditations of the graveyard school to 19th century elegies' fascination with the dead who speak. Jack's work reads 19th century poetic theory as a site of the ghost's emergence. His essay, an essay on Shelley, appeared in volume 68 of the Keep Shelley Journal, so you can check that out, and an article on the occult healing potentialities of spasmodic poetry, which is a new one for me, I must say, spasmodic poetry and its relationship to canonical 19th century elegies, forthcoming an issue of Literature and Medicine. So again, we might post those recently presented at various gatherings, including the MLA, North American Society for Study of Romanticism, and the International Gothic Association. And the title of Jack's talk is, quote, "Each moment contained eternity," close quote, lyric contagion in Mary Shelley's The Last Man. Over to you, Jack.
Thank you. So I will, in the interest of time, just begin. So this is a project that examines the quality of the narrative in Mary Shelley's novel, and it's my contention that the lyric, a form traditionally kind of associated with poetry, makes its appearance and eventually serves to displace some of the more novelistic elements of narrative momentum in Shelley's novel. So perhaps unsurprisingly, criticism has sometimes privileged poetry in its examination of the essence and the range of the lyric. In Jonathan Culler's theory of the lyric, Culler conceives of fiction as, quote, lying beyond the domain of the lyric, even as he also acknowledges that lyric contains certain types, such as dramatic monologue and ballad, that he judges to, quote, fall within the lyric, but on the borders of drama and fiction. Culler's study seeks to separate fiction and the lyric in reaction against what he perceives as a still dominant tendency in literary criticism to regard the poem as the fictional utterance of an imaginary persona, the poetic speaker. But Culler's relatively rigid separation of fiction and lyric has not gone unchallenged. In still life, suspended development in the Victorian novel, Alicia Cohn, citing color, seeks nonetheless to overcome his stark division of lyric from fiction by treating what she calls the lyric moment as, quote, embedded within the Bildungsroman as a kind of tonal prosimetrum, the technical term for poetry inset into prose. Cohn does not mean that lyric can make inroads into fiction only by appearing as an actual prosimetrum, a true interpolated poem. Rather, lyric can exist in fiction as what Cohn variously calls a tone, a mode, or a mood. Fiction can represent moments in time that interrupt what Cohn views as the Bildungsroman's forward pressure on the plot of development by accommodating lyrical states of trance, daydream, excuse me, and altered consciousness. As a tone, lyric can exist in fiction as a formal property of the text itself, enabled by a narrative device like metalepsis, which in Cohn's view produces diffusiveness and ethereality. Cohn argues that lyric acts as an intermittently anti-progressive force in the novel. Quote, lyricism allows novels to value the moments where nothing happens over the continuities that link these moments into a causal plot of self-formation. Although she differs with Color on the range of the lyric in arguing that lyricism pervades Victorian fiction, Cohn concurs in seeing the lyric as a kind of ritualistic event occurring in an atemporal lyric present. So conceived, the lyric, which Cohn reads as an antitemporal poetics of reverie and suspension, allows novelists to postpone, but not to overcome, Bildungsroman's forward development and reshape their fiction's commitment to the subjects, in Cohn's words. Yet Cohn's incisive and persuasive argument could still be extended and modified to address lyrical incursions in fiction that do not subside, dissipate, or cede power to what Cohn argues are fiction's dominant modes of progressive narration and forward movement. If lyrical subjectivity for Cohn, who endorses Color's notion of a non-progressive lyric present, can only interrupt but never displace fiction's plot structure, Mary Shelley's The Last Man, published in 1826, imagines what might happen when the lyric fully overcomes and displaces what Cohn describes as fiction's constitutive core of narrative, plot, and incident. The novel reveals that Cohn is right to treat the nexus of lyric and subjectivity as a site of suspension, but it proceeds to ask in increasingly radical ways what happens when lyric realizes itself as the final subjective displacement rather than the temporary suspension of fiction. As the novel progresses, lyric's displacement of the narrative manifests as a kind of death, the extreme version of the subject's suspended development. Contemporary 19th century poetic theory also suggests that fiction cannot always so easily accommodate the lyric. In his essay, What is Poetry?, John Stuart Mill posits not an absolute immiscibility, but an absolute distinction between poetry and fiction. Mill finds, quote, no bar to the possibility of combining both elements, poetry and narrative or incident, in the same work and calling it either a novel or a poem. But even in this case, the two elements remain, quote, perfectly distinguishable. Furthermore, Mill's description of poetry's truth as the truth of the human soul, in opposition to fiction's true picture of life, reinforces that poetry for him essentially means a subjectivized lyric of feeling. In contrast, the novelist, quote, has to describe outward things, not the inward man, actions and events, not feelings. Lyrical subjectivity announces itself under this reading as always, quote, of the nature of soliloquy. A soliloquy, moreover, that presupposes no other knowledge of mankind beyond self-knowledge. Using Mill's definition to test Cohn's accommodationist prosimetrum model of lyrical fiction produces a darker picture of the violence that lyric, when conceived purely subjectively, as a soliloquy of the self, upon the self, and to the self, might do to fiction, which for Mill is invariably the domain of incident. Anticipating Color's central distinction between the dramatic monologue and the lyric, Mill posits that poetry, in contrast to eloquence or description, is, quote, feeling confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude. If with Mill one adopts this definition of lyric, then fiction seems imperiled by lyric's very presence. Mary Shelley's The Last Man macabrely anticipates, in an extreme literalization, the consequences of Mill's idea of the lyrical subject as one who, quote, knows man but not men. Shelley's novel is at first remarkable for purportedly being a prose deciphering of characteristically romantic, lyric, and oracular Sibylline leaves. The narrative decipherer herself, quote, often wonders at the subject of the verses and at the English dress of the Latin poet. She admits that, obscure and chaotic as they are, they owe their present form to me, their decipherer. The novel is presented as an attempt to render in prose the substance of these Vedic leaves, discovered in the Sibyl's cave, but also tellingly as the narrator's labor of long hours of solitude that has, quote, taken me out of a world. Shelley anticipates Mill's idea of the poem as a soliloquy, a thing never heard but only overheard. Shelley, though, appears to be courting danger in attempting to novelize a prototypical lyric utterance, the ravings of the unintelligible Sibyl. She compares this task to reassembling the painted fragments of an artistic masterpiece. And similarly, Mill was to claim that narrative and poetry could coexist, quote, only as red and white combine on the same canvas. Shelley then takes upon herself the daunting task of narrativizing the poetic fragments that she has collected with her unnamed, recently deceased companion, a type for the drowned Percy Bysshe Shelley. Throughout the novel, Lionel Verney, the protagonist and the source of the frame narrator's prophetic voice from the future, struggles to maintain his melancholy narrative. Attempting to weave together a narrative of epic scope laden with incident, Verney writes nonetheless, as the sole survivor of humankind, the last man, undertaking the ultimate inescapable soliloquy. The effect of this foreknowledge of his own existence as the final and therefore only subject tells upon the narrative at many points. Verney exhorts himself to maintain narrative progress, quote, "O my pen, haste thou to write what was, before the thought of what is arrests the hand that guides thee. If I lift up my eyes and see the desert earth, forever I am mute." Conceivably, this threat of arrest could fit into Cohn's pattern of suspended moments of lyric and into Culler's idea of the lyric as an apostrophic present. But Verney's conception of the lyric present, of what is of a desert earth. Like the depopulated lyric universe of Mill's poet of Inward Man, Verney's dead, evacuated present is deserted of audience, intercourse, and incident. The intensification of Mill's lyric world purged of others and otherness, Verney's desert earth is peopled only by the phantoms that are his own feelings and memories. When he describes his first meeting with his then future wife, Idris, who is in this desert lyric present already long dead, Verney cannot suppress a lyrical effusion. "But you live, my Idris, even now you move before me. There was a glade, O reader, a grassy opening in the wood. The retiring trees left its velvet expanse as a temple." This lyrical atemporal locus aminus floats as a melancholy lyric arrest in the narrative, a memory that belongs to the bleak timelessness in which Verney is now trapped. It is tainted by the knowledge of death, of Idris's dear eyes that have since spent their mortal luster. These lyric scenes of foreknown doom increasingly afflict the narrative as it progresses and threaten its final arrest. Like the mysterious non-contagious plague which, quote, depended upon the air, the lyrical force of Verney's desert present inexorably depopulates and deprives of incident Verney's world, the victim of a miasmic diffusiveness that is darkly kindred to Cohn's atmospheric ethereality. Even time itself seems to exist only in the narrative past. The typical force of the narrative at first maintains itself. Verney notes, "Years passed thus, even years, each month brought forth its successor." Yet by the end of the narrative, Verney, alone and contemplating suicide, no longer perceives the successive forward pull of narrative time, but only the infinite dilation of lyric arrest. Quote, "The day passed thus, each moment contained eternity." Verney despairs in a perversion of Mill's poet with no audience. "I also will write a book, for whom to read, to whom dedicated." His only conceivable audience, as he knows, consists of, quote, "the spirits of the dead." But in fact, the narrative transmission of the lyric is horribly confused. Composed in 2100, yet channeled by the long-dead Sibyl in classical Rome, Verney's text is reassembled metaleptically by the frame narrative in 19th century Britain. It exists everywhere in time all at once, a kind of eternal, desolate rune, or a monstrous, hypertrophied lyric oracle that the novel's narrative cannot contain or overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. We've had 5 very rich presentations there. I'd like to invite everyone, basically, if you'd like to now join us so we can all see each other. Indeed, we can be illuminated, yes. And it looks like a kind of real community, doesn't it? And I will do my best to frame some questions as I keep getting them sent through from Matt. Let me just, yeah, I think I've got them. Okay, so I think I've got a question which is I'm going to ask all our speakers about, even though I think it was prompted by Rebekah's talk on the kind of queer methodology, queer reading of. The question is about there being no such thing as a normal reading of a text. I think what you've all presented is what you might call strong readings of text. It used to be fashionable, didn't it, in the past, to dwell on ambiguity all the time. But I think you've given us really impressive sort of strong readings. So the question is, if there's no such thing as a normal reading, and if it isn't just the prof mean Matt, is it profession in disguise? I wasn't sure what prof meant, but basically, if there's no such thing as a normal reading, where does such a reading reside or take place? In other words, aren't all readings, apart from those enforcing the space of the classroom, yes, individual and original, and hence queer in an expansive sense? So I guess I'm inviting you all to say something about this question in terms of having more kind of latitude to not pin down readings. And also, I think there was a question earlier about agency, about what do you mean when you refer to or think of the agency of your particular texts? I mean, exactly what kind of agency are we talking about here? It's sort of general, but I'm inviting any of our speakers to respond to that. I don't know if you want to put your hand up, whoever wants to speak, and then you can unmute yourself. Rebekah's got her hand up. You go, Rebekah.
Yeah, just to address the point about everything being queer in an expansive sense, because there's no normative. Well, for me, obviously, queer doesn't necessarily just mean different. For me, it's got to have that connection to gender and sexuality. So obviously in Christobel, there's what is variously termed as the lesbian encounter. I see it referred to as that a lot, which makes me chuckle a little bit. And a lot of readings of that I've kind of done within not necessarily like a consciously homophobic framework, but a very, very heteronormative one. So for me, it's quite important to have a reading that is kind of definitively queer. But I do understand the question in the sense that a lot of my work deals with this idea of queer space, which is to do with kind of queering that idea of spatiality itself. But that comes from a place of understanding space as gendered in the first place. So you're still working with that gender and that sexuality aspect to it. And to me, that is kind of a necessary thing to term something queer.
Thanks. Would anyone like to follow up? I don't know. I mean, Amanda's talk was also about space, wasn't it, to some extent? I mean, I could see productive overlaps between the papers in all kinds of ways, but the sort of idea of trespassing and Claire's point about women occupying sort of men's roles, if you like, in this case, as a kind of commentator on text, and that kind of empowering, and that then gets by the kind of establishment as a form of sort of, acting up or something. But would anyone else like to chip in here with questions about agency, or I mean, there's a follow-up question on that question about where does form itself reside, which is quite a deep question, but does form really inhabit these texts, or are you creating the form in your so I'm very happy to open it up. Did you put your hand? Yeah, and Claire, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. If I may just go back to, I think it was Gary Kelly who asked who made the point about agency as, I guess, a bit of a maybe kind of gimmicky term. He didn't use that phrase, but no, but I did think actually when I was writing the paper, I've noticed myself using it a lot as a bit of a kind of catch-all word to discuss, I guess, different kinds of kind of active actions, as it were. That's a bit of a, it's not a great phrase, but kind of moments in text, for instance, where the question of women kind of making informed decisions, I guess, with marriage, for instance, with Inchbald, and the question of women thinking about marrying and whom they're marrying, and not having it as a default position. And so I guess agency as used as kind of encompassing different kinds of action and kind of deliberate action, rather than kind of responding to things or being kind of a passive recipient, accepting I don't know, paternal, tyrannical authority and other forms. So I think I do need to, I think a little bit more about this kind of word agency that I use, so perhaps too generously.
Does anyone else want to comment on their type of agency? Jack's got his hand up now.
I find kind of particularly strange in Shelley's novel the way in which we traditionally, I think, associate agency with subjectivity and with the affordances of being a subject. And at least in my reading of that text, the more subjectivity one accumulates, right, the deeper the lyricism of one's own kind of subject position, the less agency is there to develop, right? That the subject tends towards its own kind of interiority and self-absorption, and as John Stuart Mill would suggest, right, in reading lyric poetry, that ultimately tends towards a kind of almost death-centered inwardness, right? And so I think there's a kind of interesting tension between associating agency with the subject, but then at the same time, the kind of burgeoning of subjectivity tends to erase one's own agency, right? Tends to erase one's own activity and ability to affect incident and developments. So I think Shelley is kind of deeply interested in that strange conflict between taking action and then acting in a kind of mode of contemplation, and the way that contemplation can displace and ultimately cancel one's own ability to act.
I think that's interesting. I mean, if I can just come in, I wonder if this question of agency and lyricism is sort of still haunting Romanticism, because it's such a key part of the, the kind of construction of classic construction of Romanticism, isn't it? But it comes from a kind of withdrawal of, kind of agency in the quote real world. In other words, the world of conflict and war and violence, which is what Shelley, our Shelley the speaker here, was talking about with Sardanapalus, that he would like to live in that kind of lyrical world, self-absorption and kind of stasis, and kind of almost pretends that the violence is not going to reach him. Okay, I've got some follow-up questions for Rebekah, but I'm just trying to sort of invite Amanda and Shelley into the discussion a little bit here. If you had any ways of fitting your talk into these kind of dichotomies of, subjectivity, and I wonder if that's always more conflicted or conflicted in a different way when you're talking about, gender. So when women step into the world of agency or exert agency, so it's sort of more imperiled in different ways than when men or male characters. I don't know. I'm just sort of throwing out a hook here, but I can see links here between the papers in terms of this sort of privileged space for what I think they call the monologue. That lyrical moment that Romanticism was so elevated in sort of literary genres, hasn't it? And I think we're hearing interesting you know, versions of that dichotomy in all these talks, when you kind of announce your presence or exert your presence. But if you don't want to come in, I'll. Do you want to come in, Amanda? I'm not. Put your hand up.
Sure,
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Sure. No, I found I mean, that's an interesting question to think about agency here, because I guess I've been thinking about, you know, internalized norms, but then there's, you know, Camilla's really kind of committed in a certain way to, you know, to like kind of carrying out, you know, the emotion that she should have, you know, with respect to her family and all of that. So it's sort of, I mean, I think it's kind of interesting to be like, well, in a certain way, like Camilla is just really, you know, carrying out the norms of the marriage-centric culture, and, you know, the feelings about the family that go with that. But on the other hand, she's just doing it so tenaciously, you know, and the word imagination is used so much with her staging of these interactions with men, and she's really kind of going out, you know, doing more than anyone would really dream that she should do, in her desperation to conform to, you know, what's wanted of her. So, yeah, I mean, I guess I do. I mean, I was thinking about the term queer too. I mean, there's this excessive normativeness that sort of, you know, that I think about with that, which I think does have a certain kind of agency to it, being so aggressively passive. I don't know.
I think we had a follow-up question from Colette, but maybe Colette, you can ask it rather than I'm trying to find it now, to Amanda. And then there's some follow-up questions from Adam as well, who can maybe ask his questions. Colette?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I was just thinking, kind of from what Jack was saying about different types of subjectivities, and like I thought that subject position was central. And a question that I had from your paper was, how do you read the character of Eugenia Tyrrell in relation to your focus on the marriage plot? Because you were talking about what Camilla does and how she pursues her family's dream, as well as her own. And I just wondered, was Eugenia part of your considerations?
Well, she becomes a part of the consideration in the larger project just as a reader, because I guess a part of my project is focusing on, you know, getting lost in the novel as well. And, you know, her susceptibility to, I'm kind of now forgetting the name of that character who she thinks is good and isn't good and all of that. But, you know, so I think that she very much, you know, wants to kind of step into a certain sort of plot that kind of pre-exists her in a way, but, you know, in a certain way, I'm thinking of Sarah Ahmed again, and in a certain way, I guess, I don't know, like I guess kind of like Rebekah, I wouldn't really use the term queer normally to describe, you know, someone who doesn't have, you know, a different, you know, a non-heteronormative sexuality, but I do think it, you know, in the terms of Sarah Ahmed and queer phenomenology, kind of not conforming to norms in a certain way or not being able to fulfill a certain ideal can like then set you along a different path. And I guess that's what, yeah, that's kind of what I see Eugenia doing.
Cool, thanks very much. I forgot it too, but it's Bellamy, the character. Thank you.
Just to say that Gary Kelly is putting, you know, some comment and you know, I wonder if we can make sure we save them, Matt, and they can then be circulated to the speakers at the end, Gary, if we don't get a chance to come round to. I was just wondering if I could draw Shelley into the Shelley, our speaker, Shelley, into the conversation, Shelley, on this sort of theme. I wondered, with this tension between sort of lyric and narrative, and you were suggesting that there was a kind of utopian ending. I mean, I was intrigued by, is this sort of two sides of Byron here, or it's sort of almost two sides of romanticism? You know, the Byron who's going to go and die in the Greek Revolution, yeah, and the Byron who's holed up in with his you know, lover in a kind of palace. And I mean, it might be a bit crass to put it that way, but I'm asking a more general question about how those two modes, if you like, that you were dwelling on, relate to the sort of historical circumstances. Because one thing I'd like in a way for all the speakers to reflect on is how your your texts and your approaches fit in with the kind of historical moments that, you know, and I think of 1821 and Byron's closet dramas, you know, it's a very revolutionary moment, isn't it? That sort of 19 through to 20, particularly in Europe. And you may not want to answer it in that way, but I just wondered if you saw how you saw this dichotomy in more maybe wider sense.
It's for this one, it's actually, I don't think it's related to the revolutionary aspect of Byron's later life as much. This one is the background for this play was mostly I think it rose out of an argument that he had with Countess oh my god, I just totally forgot the name. Basically, the theme of love rose into prominence rather than conflict and everything else. And I think for this one, at least for this one, it's not supposed. We shouldn't link it into Byron's personal life that much. At least for this one, he's always very paradoxical, and even in this one, in this play, it provides a really ambiguous and very open-ended reading for people. So probably enough for this one. I'm sorry, I'm not making a lot of sense because I'm getting a bit
No, that's
tired.
fine. I just wondered why he was absolutely clear he didn't want it wasn't to be performed, and yet you think, you know, that's one way to reach a wide audience. If you want some agency, why not get the thing out there in circulation, you know, to sort of seen, you know, and heard.
This is a very interesting bit. I read an article about sort of the background of its publication history. It was mostly under the influence of the Italian closet dramatist Vittorio Alvieri, who just sort of saw the whole business of staging a play. It's honestly just a business. It's like a byproduct of writing and reading. So he was very against it, and I felt that Byron perhaps was also he also had that idea. He was repulsed by the way that his previous plays were staged in England without his permission, and maybe he didn't like the way that they were performed. And I think for Byron, this special genre of the closet drama, it bears more formal significance or structural significance for Byron than regular closet plays. So basically, it's I think there's a whole different that's a whole different conversation that we can have on that one, but it doesn't have that much to do with agency as it is presented in the theme of the play. I don't think.
No, that's fine. I wondered if I could. So thanks for that, Adam. Whose face I can see here. Do you want to come off the camera? There we go, Adam, and ask one or two questions of your own.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. Well, my question was just for Rebekah, and I was just thinking about Christobel and an article I read about the Aeolian Harp by Timothy Morton. I was researching that for my dissertation, and he's basically talking about how that poem evidences a sort of like queer materiality, where there's this the sound that's kind of floating around, going where it pleases. He kind of talks about the poem as a speech bubble, and has this interesting way of looking at it. And then there's a different academic, Susan Wolfson, who talks about how Coleridge links light and sound together. So I just had that thought, like, did you think about the way that, because I think in Christobel there's plenty of sounds. It starts out with the dog barking, and there's all kinds of like little noises. Did you think about the way that those kind of things also tie into this sort of, I like the idea of this kind of opening and closing space, the spotlight, right? The way those things and the light kind of feed into that dialectic. Thanks.
Yeah, so I had this whole thing on sound and silence planned out as part of my thesis, but then my supervisor was like, you have too many words. So it's not fully realized, but yeah, I've thought a lot about this. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because Christobel is this poem and it's full of like sound and silence, and those kind of repeating sounds at the beginning are really interesting because they're all kind of related to the castle. So you've got like the dog is barking and the bell is ringing and the bell rings again and again throughout the poem. And it kind of, to me, that noise is kind of the same, acting kind of the same way as like the flaring up of light does. It's kind of this warning, because it's constantly bringing you back to like the patriarchal domesticity, if you like, represented by the castle. So there's that aspect of it. And yeah, there's the silence, and a lot of people read the silence as like a curse. But to me, it's kind of this instinctive kind of safety mechanism thing going on. And there's sort of still a lot of kind of silent communication between them looking at each other in sort of the second part of the poem. So yeah, my ideas on that are not fully realized, but I did have this whole thing on sound and how sound disrupts the physicality of space, because it's a pressure wave, right? So, and it's also really uncanny because each particle does the same motion as the particle before, but slightly out of time, right? So there's this whole thing about how sound is uncanny and how like certain acts of speaking, you can read in them this physical disruption of space. I think that's really interesting, and it is definitely something I would love to do more on at some point in the future. So yeah, thank you. That was a really interesting question and something I did want to talk about.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, I know how it is. Yeah, thank you.
There's your postdoc, Rebecca. Yeah, I've got one quick follow-up for Anne Claire, and then maybe we should think of an approach, not too far away from 6:30. But there's a specific question for Anne Claire as well. Anne Claire, does your project include Joanna Baillie's plays on the passions? If yes, do you see any point of connection to your work on Inchbald? I suppose if the answer is no, then there's not to say, but hopefully it's yes.
Well, the answer is, I guess 6 months ago, I would have said no, because actually when I started my project, I hadn't actually thought about considering the theatre and drama, even though it's an obvious site of kind of representation of women's speech. And I've not looked at the plays on the passions in a long time, but Joanna Baillie's definitely on my list, and Inchbald speaks very highly of Baillie. There's one play that's included in the British Theatre, which is De Montfort, and Inchbald uses the word genius 4 times, I think, in that sort of short space of 4 or 5 pages, and she really praises obviously Baillie's play. And also something I think is really interesting about Inchbald's remarks is that she doesn't single out female playwrights as necessarily better than male playwrights, or just she judges both male and female playwrights on the same terms. And for instance, she counsels Joanna Baillie to think about drama as something that is performed and not just written for the closet. And she tells her, Shakespeare had experience in the theatre. So it's not a complete answer to Ian's question, but yes, Joanna Baillie will definitely feature in there, and women's theatrical criticism more generally as well.
Excellent. I mean, there's 2 minutes left. I know Matt Sangster had it was you, wasn't it, Matt, who had a kind of general question. I wonder if you just want to put it as a kind of comment as much as a question. Matt, you want to do that?
Sure, I can unmute quickly. I just sort of wanted just to sort of throw out a general question for people to comment on this sort of question of form, and to what extent in the cases you're discussing, form works as a trap. It sounds like that happens with the marriage plot or marriage expectations in Amanda's paper, and to what extent the sort of form creates a space in which you can say things more freely than you would elsewhere. It seemed a little bit that way with Anne Claire's point about criticism, where Inchbald it's got a question about whether she's able to take the position of critic. She does take that position and then uses it to express quite sort of strong political opinions that might have been more difficult if they weren't placed within the form of criticism. So I wonder whether anyone had just sort of brief remarks on that balance of form as a sort of space between a free space and a prison.
I mean, in a way, you've given out a great sort of trope there for our speakers to take away, haven't you? Yeah, because I'm aware it is 6:30, and obviously some people are leaving. So I wonder if I should thank our 5 speakers, Shelley, Amanda and Claire, Rebekah and Jack, for, you know, stimulating presentations. Obviously, it's very difficult in 10 minutes, isn't it, to put forward, you know, to kind of give us a snapshot of bigger projects, but I thought you all did it admirably. And, you know, we've got a lot to take away with us, I think, here, that the question of form and content, which is an old chestnut, isn't it, in many ways, that there's still plenty of critical mileage, you know, in that. So, so very much I'd like to, you can unmute if you want and thank our speakers as we sort of close the session. And I'd like to, you know, thank our speakers. And I'd like to maybe just invite Matt or Colette to just say something about, you know, the delights of you know, what else is coming up in this series. But it's nice for everyone to come on camera now and show yourself. Would Colette or Matt want to say something, or Anna, about the next event in the series?
Oh, well, we can say that just in the chat, Matt has shared the next event, which is about returning to Romantic Italy on Thursday, April the 15th at 5 o'clock. And yeah, Francesca's also shared in the chat more information about where you can follow our next events. But thank you so much to our panel for such a fascinating range of talks. And also thank you to Ian for wonderful chairing and lots of stimulating questions from the audience too. Yeah.
Right, so we can all applaud ourselves, and we can all, whatever time it is, you know, I hope we can all go and sort of have some kind of refreshments and some downtime now, yeah, and enjoy the kind of afterglow or the illumination. Wow, Catherine Boyle there has got a beer in her hand. That's ideal, yeah. So so lovely to see you all, and see you again soon, I hope. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.